But okay. So hi everybody. Thank you for joining us. I'm Carola Frediani, an Italian journalist working at La Stampa, and I'm very glad to be here with this great panelists that then I will introduce you in a minute. Today the topic is, it's a very hot topic, which cyberwar, which is actually also a very hyped word, especially on the media, and includes very different things. I think to understand a little bit the scenario, we should remind ourselves that now it's almost 3 years since, for instance, the Snowden revelations about the huge systems of surveillance built by US NSA and the British GCHQ. And according to Snowden, his main motivation was to start a debate on this and related topics. And there has been a debate, indeed, in part. In the US, there have been modest attempts to curb the NSA powers, restricting domestic bulk data collection. But other countries went the other way. For instance, I don't know if you know, but in the UK, at the moment, there is a draft bill on surveillance that consolidates in law the bulk data collection, the collection of bulk data from the users, adding more powers, and also it consolidates the idea of state hacking. I mean, they did it before, but in secret, and now they are making it explicit. In the UK bill, for instance, there is even a requirement to store everyone's web searches and to hack computers more easily. In other countries, such as France, also because of terrorism, there is new legislation enhancing surveillance and hacking has been passed or been considered. Also, if you have followed the news, you have seen that in the last month there has been a very hot debate about encryption related to the fight between Apple and FBI. And so suddenly we were having a really weird debate about encryption, if it's good or not, if we should ban it or not, about backdoor, what is a backdoor, about the power of state to hack networks and computers. And in a way, it was also a sort of time machine, back in time to a past debate. There are a lot of things at stake, different issues that are related together, like encryption, trojans, backdoors, also the cyber warfare or cyber war between states. We know that states are engaged more and more in offense operations. We have seen it also from the Snowden documents and from other scandals, recent scandals, and that they are feeding a market of vulnerabilities and exploits. So this is the scenario we are starting this debate from. And now I would like to introduce you Marcel Rosenbach, a journalist from the Spiegel, and he has been covering surveillance, hacking, cyberwar topics, and he has been working also on Snowden documents and writing about cyberwar. Let's use this word, even if we can have some objection about it. Okay. So I let you the word.
Thanks so much for the introduction. Hello, everybody. Yes, indeed. I mean, this is now working? Oh, okay. So again, thanks for having me on this panel. Thanks for the invitation, and thanks for the introduction. Actually, I had two problems with the topic of this talk. A little bit of problem with the hot in it, and with the term cyberwar, because as you obviously know, there's this term, never talk of cyber unless you're William Gibson. I'm not William Gibson, so. But perhaps we can talk about several aspects of this phenomenon, and we will be talking perhaps about cyber sabotage, cyber espionage, and it's easier to talk about cyberwar. So perhaps I would like to start from a journalistic standpoint, why this topic perhaps is not hot or hyped, but is very difficult to cover for journalists. And I think it's exceptionally difficult, and there is a big, thick wheel or fog of cyber war. We have a fog of war in more traditional ways of warfare. Here, the thick or wheel is exceptionally thick, obviously, because what we face is something we can't see, smell, or identify at first sight. It's not very essential. If you have more classic ways of warfare, you have tanks, you have real people, you have weapons you possibly can identify. It's much more difficult in that sphere. The scarcity of sources is a very big problem. Still, the field is comparatively narrow, and of course you have, as a journalist, always to be aware that there are interests involved if you get leaks from a sphere. We have, in this arena, we have had mostly official leaks, actually. At least that's my impression over the last couple of years, or even 15 years. We had many official leaks, not so many whistleblowers in that arena. And of course, the topic is highly technical, highly abstract, so the conventional wisdom of an ordinary journalist is really being challenged. We have to work with people with more technical expertise, more knowledge, people like Claudio we have been working with, and he will tell you some of the more technical aspects, and it's important to have this kind of competence when dealing with the issue. So rather than diminishing it by talking about perhaps it's not so hot or even a little bit hyped, I think it's a really relevant issue, an extremely relevant issue, and perhaps to make it, I was talking about this official leaks over the last 15 years, at least from a German perspective, but I think that is true with an international view on the topic. What we have seen was mostly when it came to the offensive side of things, computer network operations, like it's called in the official speak. You could get the impression as a reader or as a viewer or even as a journalist that most of those offensive attacks would originate in Russia or China, at least from a Western perspective. Why was that so? That was based on reports from scientific institutions that had often some kind of connection to the US military-industrial complex, to authorities, to universities that were close to the American military. And so for us, it was really an eye-opener to work with the Snowden material, which is up until now actually mostly connected with this term surveillance. Basically, what we saw and what we are still trying to convey as a message is that surveillance is only one step and the first step. And as we know, surveillance can lead to actually deadly strikes, talking about drones. And it is the first and important step into this arena of offensive operations. And what we saw there, I think Claudio will be the better person to elaborate on certain technical aspects, but we saw programs like Treasure Map, we saw the so-called Genie program, and that's another point why it's relevant. We had those parts of the black budget, of the US black budget. You could see how this field of operations actually was manned up over the last couple of years, is being still manned up, and has been granted really high funds. And if you would talk to military personnel in Germany, but in the US as well, they have cuts all over the place. But there is one place where there are no cuts, but really spendings and more spendings, and that is exactly in that arena. And I could go on, but I think I don't want to use too much time. And
no, I just wanted to say that this is an extract of this budget that Marcel was just mentioning.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's the on Genie, I think, right? Yeah. That's exactly the point, which is very, for the first time, we got a better understanding on the offensive side of things in the US, how actually the central command within the NSA works, is organized. We had the first few on the certain parts of the NSA working on specific solutions for cyberwar, like TAO, tailored access operations, and got a better understanding and got background to things like Stuxnet, and talking about the relevance of things from today. In the last couple of days, there were reports that Ashton Carter, the defense secretary, actually for the first time announced officially cyberwar against ISIS. We had revelations, which is kind of interesting because he did it like 2 months after Anonymous did the same thing. And we had actually revelations several weeks ago that Stuxnet, perhaps the most well-known example of cyber warfare when it comes to actual physical damage that was achieved with it, was part of a much larger program indeed. And I think we see some background on this up there in other Snowden documents on a program called Neutral Zeus that actually was aimed at the whole infrastructure of Iran, and not only the nuclear enrichment facility at Natanz. And so thinking about relevance, and I could elaborate on that later on, I think it's a very relevant topic.
Yeah, okay. Thank you. Thank you, Marcel, for this first introduction to this complex topic. I would like now to introduce you Claudio Guarnieri, who is a well-known security researcher who actually has been working on malware and also on state-level malware, and he probably can help us to understand more some of these aspects.
Yeah, thank you. Well, before getting to technical details, I just wanted to pick up on some of the things that Marcel said. And one of them is I want to really underline the point that he was making on the importance on reporting about these matters when it comes to not just cyber warfare, but cyber espionage and normally technical matters, but have a lot of relevance in the public sphere. For many reasons. The first one being that it's true, and Marcel made a great point, that much of what we know, or at least of what we knew until the Snowden documents, was very biased. Most of the information that comes on these topics generally comes from a security industry which is very US-centric, and being a security industry which is very intertwined with the state apparatus, it has a certain bias, and certain information doesn't come to the public. And that creates a rigged perception of what is actually going on in the world and in cyberspace as a battlefield in some sense, because if we only get a perception and a description of what certain countries are doing, but we don't know what is the counterpart for Western countries, we don't really have a good understanding of what the capabilities are around and what are the issues around all these kinds of activities on the internet. And that's one point. The second point is because another reason why I believe it's really important and relevant for journalists to pick up as a topic to cover more and investigate even more, is because it's one of the only methods that we have as a civil society and as a public to keep some checks and balances on how these operations are being led and how much is being invested in these types of activities and these types of capacity building by the states. Much of the capabilities of these intelligence agencies and military forces and so on relies on the pure fact of maintaining computer systems insecure. They need to maintain access to vulnerability and to exploits and to networks and all these kinds of things which are very intrusive and offensive and detrimental to the security of the internet as an ecosystem, but also to technology in general. When the basic trend and the basic requirement is that certain computer systems and software and these kinds of things need to be maintained insecure for granting access and leverage to intelligence agencies to do their things. On the long run, it's a disruptive trend, right? Because if more money, and we've seen the budget, we're talking about a lot of money. We're talking about billions of dollars. It's being invested in distracting technologies. In the long run, this will have a negative effect on the security for all. And by talking about these things and reporting about these things, we can kind of compare it to war reporting of the 21st century, right? Much of modern conflict, modern intelligence is done over the internet, over signals intelligence, over breaking into computers and breaking into systems. So it is relevant for the public to know what their governments are doing with their tax money. And that kind of also maintains the technical and economic balance. By exposing certain tools and exposing that some vulnerabilities are being used, not only these kinds of things can get fixed, technically speaking, and so the technical community can know about some of the problems that exist, and there's not a revelations of being critical in doing so. But it also always increases the cost of operating this type of attacks. Increase the cost of developing new malware, developing new exploits, finding new vulnerabilities is a cost for everybody to do that kind of stuff. And the more we talk about it, the more costly it becomes. And so you kind of can keep it under control to a certain degree. And that's just my parenthesis on why I believe it is important to report about these matters, despite being very complex and very technical to some degree. It is also, Marcel was mentioning, it's a complicated cyber war, is a complicated topic to deal with from a journalistic point of view, but it's also a complicated topic to deal with from a technical point of view. And it is as much of a problem for the technical community to define and understand what cyber war is as it is for the journalistic community. When it comes to technical aspects, cyber war doesn't differ really much from anything else. It is very much mixed up and intertwined with all sorts of other cyber offensive activities, cyber espionage, cyber terrorism, cyber crime. There isn't really a strong difference from a technical point of view. The difference, you can perhaps define it in the intent of the attacks. But that's always not always very clear, and always operating in the internet, it's always very hard to identify who is behind the attack, and without knowing who is behind, it's difficult to estimate what was the intent of the attack. And that makes it very hard to tell it apart from other things. What is cyber war? What is the difference between cyber war and cyber espionage and surveillance? It's a very narrow difference. And not being able to differentiate it, it's very difficult for us also as technical people to react to it and give answers to non-technical communities. I think we're still somewhat in an early stage of cyber warfare, despite being a term that it's not very much loved in the technical community, for a pure reason of fact that we're still military forces are led by officials that are have not grown on the internet, have not grown in living and learning how technology and how the internet functions. And so the understanding of warfare is still very old to some degree. We'll probably get to the point of really seeing and understanding the effects and the look of cyber warfare in some years when new generals and new military officials will come in from the internet generation. And that will perhaps be a much more clear cut and a much more identifiable difference. But up to this point, it's kind of difficult to say. We have seen examples of cyber war from many years ago. It's not really a new thing. I actually signed down some examples thinking about some of the things that I remember from the past. And you have examples of technology and digital attacks being used in somewhat military operations from already in 1999 and 2001. For instance, we had examples at that time of Chinese hackers coordinating to perpetrate attacks against US government institutions and commercial institutions as a retaliation for the bombing of Chinese embassy in Belgrade and other similar incidents and military actions of that time. Other examples that are very prominent and very well known: in 2007, the attacks on the Estonian infrastructure. 2008, we have attacks on the Georgian infrastructure preceding the Russian invasion of that time. 2010, as Marcel mentioned, we had Stuxnet, which is kind of the most well-known and probably one of their very few concrete examples of technical means being used to cause kinetic damage. 2014 perhaps could also be an example with Sony. Is Sony could be an example of cyber warfare? I'm not entirely sure. In 2015, we had example again with ISIS becoming prominent on the internet and making very much use of the technical techniques. There's this thing called the cyber caliphate, and some of the hackers involved into that, into those operations have also been victim of drone strikes. So that perhaps it's one of the most, one of the closest examples of cyber warfare we have. But in all of these cases, again, the role of technical people is very important to help understanding what is going on, but it's very difficult for us without supporting source material, as Snowden documents are and similar leaks have been, to really understand what happened. With Stuxnet, for instance, we never had source material. Just now things are starting becoming public because many years have passed. But otherwise, it's almost impossible to really pinpoint certain attacks to certain governments, which is one of the major differences to normal warfare. In normal warfare, there's rules and there's laws, and people engage and declare war, and there's certain guidelines and rules that need to be followed, and people can kind of monitor quite easily what happens in a conflict. And on the internet, this just doesn't exist. And I'm sure that states don't really want that to exist either, because the internet and the lack of attribution is a perfect instrument to maintain plausible deniability, which obviously makes it very difficult for us to report about these matters in a scientific and journalistic way.
Thank you, Claudio. Yeah, I think one of the problems for journalists to deal with these topics, especially when you don't have very specific cases and documents, as you said, is that they tend to look really far away from the experience of common users, like something. But so I'm very happy to introduce Gulsin Harman, who is a journalist from Turkey, who has been working on digital attacks on journalists and digital protection on journalists, because I think she could give us an insight on a more practical field of what can mean this kind of topic. So.
No? Okay. Thank you so much. Well, I was a journalist. I'm still a journalist, but currently we are running a project in Turkey with International Press Institute. It is called On the Line. The main aim is to counter digital attacks against Turkish journalists. First, I will keep the term cyberwar because it defines perfectly what's happening in Turkey, and also a very interesting case in Turkey that a state with its agencies declared a cyberwar against its citizens against its citizens' rights to information, to freedom of speech, and press freedom. And I would like to add some context about current situation in Turkey. Please bear in mind that in Turkey, internet is not the primary source or complementary source for independent journalism. It's the unique source. We don't have any other outlet now. The mainstream media, the traditional media, totally lacks any capacity to perform its universal duties. And the censorship and self-censorship, it's wide. So the only refuge that people can take in matters of the free press, free information flow is the internet. For example, International Press Institute's special report on Turkey in 2015 stated very accurately that given the amount of pressure brought to bear on traditional media, a large degree of critical coverage in Turkey has migrated on internet. And Freedom House also has a report from last year I strongly recommend if you are interested in any development in Turkey in terms of press freedom. And it is called The Struggle for Turkey's Internet. And in this report, it is stated that Turkey is a battleground state for internet regulation on a global level. So IPI runs this project on the line since the new year. We are collecting cases of attacks, digital attacks against journalists. We have a reporting platform that thanks to the global leaks, and that the journalists can report the attacks that they are having. We provide technical and legal help to the victims. So I would go with the type of the attacks and the subtypes of the attacks that we came so far. We have 4 subtypes for Turkish journalists. First, it's the threats of violence. As you can understand, imminent threat of death, physical harm to family members and to close circles. And it is really wide and persistent in Turkey, especially when a journalist is engaged in a matter of closely related to Kurdish conflict or terrorism issue. The probability that they will get threats of violence increases. The second category, it's abusive behavior. It's a very vast category. We have in this category identity theft, cyber surveillance, smear campaigns, posting of defamatory content, false material, false framing of context. And in that case, as you can imagine, here enters the troll armies. 3 years ago with the Gezi Park protest, very fiercely anti-government protest, I guess that maybe you know already, it started with it was a protection and preservation of a park in the middle of Istanbul, but it grew to something much more bigger. And the protesters were organized especially through Twitter, and then the Turkish government had the idea, maybe this is a sphere that we should control and we should be more predominant. So and it is widely accepted that they follow the example of Russia. And so we had the troll armies. For example, in 2014, just days before the local elections in Turkey, Twitter had removed thousands of bot accounts, saying that they had manipulative motives. And the fight is still going on. And the smear campaigns are mostly started by this and reinforced by the bot accounts. But the most alarming thing is the smear campaigns against Turkish journalists. Not only bots, but they are mostly retweeted and disseminated by the pro-government columnists and journalists with huge audiences. And even some cases we have seen that the advisors to the president himself are helping to disseminate smear campaigns against Turkish journalists. And about the cyber surveillance, we had just a case a week earlier. It's a very interesting case. A Kurdish blogger who are really active on the peace resolution attempts that we had in recent years. She went to Northern Ireland to study the Irish process there, and somehow they decided that it's a good idea, not a good idea, but they decided that they should wiretap her. But the thing is, she was within a delegation, and the delegation included Tony Blair's advisor. So the Turkish government, by accidentally, started to wiretap Tony Blair's advisor also. And we had this case, and she was already having a huge problems with the blocking to her blog, blocking of content. So we are trying to help her technically. And in the third category, I would say technical interference, and this is where the panelists and I think the audience will be much more interested. On this category, we enlist web defacement, DDoS attacks, hacking of social media accounts, malware and spyware, use of malware and spyware against journalists. DDoS attacks, it's not happening very, very often in Turkey, but when it happens, it has a certain toll. Because please also bear in mind that the independent journalists and media outlets in cyberspace in Turkey operates with already really scarce financial resources. And they had really hard times to convince digital advertisers to be involved in their project. So when they encounter a DDoS attacks, and for example, if their website is out of business for 2 days or 3 days in a row, they are certainly damaged, and financially they are doomed to collapse. For example, 2 weeks later, we had such a case. Sanat Atak, it's an art news website, and one of the very prominent and known actresses in Turkey, Füsun Demirel, she just in an interview she said that when I was a young girl, I really wanted to be a guerrilla fighting against the Turkish army. And it happens to be that her sister is also an artist, so she wrote an open letter in support of her sister. And Sanat Atak, as being an art news website involving these 2 artists, they published the letter. First, they became face-to-face with a deluge of threats on social media, and then DDoS attacks. We helped them, we provided technical help to them. But it was 2 weeks ago, but just 2 days ago, they had it again. And they are really concerned that if it keeps going on, these DDoS attacks, we won't be able to counter them, and maybe we will be forced to shut down completely. Also, it gives a very, how to say, precise idea that in Turkey, not even the art news websites are not secure. They are now, due to the highly political polarization in the country, even an art news website is not protected anymore. So in the fourth category, we have improper legal and procedural threats. As you don't have a huge interest in Turkey, I'm sure that you are well aware of the Turkey has become quite famous blocking YouTube, Twitter, and social media accounts. And although the blocking of Twitter and YouTube is easy, they are easy to make the headlines, but Turkish independent news websites deals with a huge numbers of blockings. For example, there's one very leftist-leaning website called Sendika. It means union in Turkey. They have been, in the last year, they have been blocked 11 times. And each time they had to change their domain name, and every time they changed the domain name, they have lost a part of their audience. So they were already struggling to find audience. So the changing doesn't have, for example, gian.org. It's an also leftist-leaning website. They had to change their domain name also, and we spoke to them 2 weeks ago. They told that the audience was like about 30,000, but when we had to change the domain name due to blocking, it's now down to 3,000, I guess. So they have lost to 90% of their audience is already lost. And with the blockings and the improper legal procedures, circumvention tools are widely used in Turkey, and hopefully they are not yet touched, unlike Russia, and we are becoming a huge market in that term for circumvention tools. And I would like to add also that the blocking of the websites, of the independent websites, one of the most frightening features is in most cases, they are not even notified. So most of the blockings are arbitrary. Sometimes the courts issue some rulings, but mostly it's the digital authority in Turkey who just, based upon a request, mostly from the government and sometimes from the president himself, they act on this request and they don't notify the website that they are blocked. So they have to figure out and they have to formulate a quick response. And so I would like to add also that maybe it is not very complementary to the panel, but online harassment also. And it's a very important issue in Turkey. And sexual abuse against female journalists in online sphere is also, I would consider it as a part of the cyberwar and a very important and alarming tool. So we have according to the initial findings that we have from the cases, 80% of the attacks is against female journalists. And every time that whatever the female journalist comments, shares an article, there's always a very disturbing sexual component in the attack. So these are my presentation. This is my presentation about Turkey, and thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Gulsin. Yeah, I think we have seen some of the problems talking about these topics. We talked about the attribution problem, the scarcity of sources Marcel was talking about, the fact that we are talking also about national security matters, and that complicates also because you have less transparency, also different laws sometimes about the coverage, and the fact that attacks are often spread in different nations, so you really just see like a few pieces of a bigger puzzle, and the fact that we are dealing with more and more private and public systems where states are like buying services from private companies, maybe buying them from some other intermediaries, and so on. So I was thinking, I have a general question to the panelists. I don't know want to answer. I mean, how can we overcome some of the problems we have just talked about in dealing with these topics? For instance, maybe some of the things we have already seen in the last years covering some of these topics could help, like, you know, like closer collaboration between journalists and security researchers on one hand, or maybe more forms of networked journalism, because they are really, as I said, international topics spread on different states. So more collaboration among journalists in different countries may help to reconstruct some of these puzzles. So I don't know if any of you want to make some observations about this. Marcel.
Well, I think cooperation, of course, is important, but even more important, I think, is the source question. And I can only speak for myself, and I think for the other involved journalists, Claudio perhaps, for us it was a huge leap forward to have actual source material thanks to a whistleblower like Edward Snowden. I think, first of all, we need source material that is not steered by official interests and that helps to understand the mechanics behind the phenomenon we're trying to describe and we're seeing the effects of. And it cannot be stated enough that one of the problems Claudio mentioned is really the problem of attribution, and another layer of the problem is actually that we're talking about a thing we perhaps can define as warfare, but the department where it is actually being planned and where it's actually being done is not so much the military anymore, but it's secret services, intelligence services all around the world. And that actually adds to the problem. And it's a holistic thing, of course, what you just described in the situation in Turkey, absolutely, I would say, is part of information warfare, which is, of course, a part of the concept that is integral in the concept of war right now. To any campaign, actually, we see there is this layer of information warfare. Sometimes it's described as hybrid warfare altogether, but this component is there to be seen in practically every campaign we see in the world, and we see in Turkey especially right now. Yeah, cooperation is important, of course. Awareness for the topic is important. It's important to try to find narratives to actually convey the story, the relevance of the story, and most of all, it's important to have genuine sources and to have whistleblowers who speak up and who would actually tell the stories, even more so than we actually see this shift into this sphere of intelligence, and we actually do not have anything close to a system like being that part of the Geneva Conventions, being that part of the rules and regulations for conventional warfare. So we have a really gray area here, and we see actually that not many states have laid out their legal concepts about what they are actually doing. And one of the things perhaps that actually shows you the importance why this is necessary is that one of the states that actually does have something like a doctrine is the United States. And what they say is that if the United States is being targeted with a cyber attack that has grave consequences for the US in the definition of the US, they would reserve the right to counter that with a conventional strike. So if you now think about what happened to Iran and with Stuxnet, which had grave consequences, everybody would acknowledge, if they would adopt that doctrine, you would then think that it's common knowledge now that it not had only been the US behind Stuxnet, but Israel as well. You probably understand that this gray area is really geopolitically really dangerous and of great importance.
Yeah, this is really a leap. This way you were saying, this fact that you can retaliate on the physical level. And actually, I was thinking about the problem of the scarcity of sources. We probably need better laws on whistleblower and whistleblowing, because they risk really too much about whistleblowing on this kind of topics. So maybe this is something we should keep in mind when we talk about this. I don't know if you want to add something, but I have also another question, maybe for you. How much do you think that the terrorism scare in this moment is pushing an agenda on all these topics?
I just wanted to add another comment on the previous question, which I agree completely with what Marcel said. There's a great role for technical people to take more part in journalistic work for a few reasons. Firstly, because, again, these are very technical matters. And even in these Snowden documents go to a certain degree of explaining what happens. Perhaps because of, I don't know, lack of certain types of classified material, but still it doesn't go into depth on explaining how these things work, and doesn't always cover all the cases in which they've been used. And so technical people can be very useful in taking that material and bringing it further and researching and investigating further and identifying new cases that perhaps wouldn't have been discovered otherwise. But at the same time, the Snowden documents have been critical in this sense, because it's been probably the first and only time up to this point in which they managed to give technical people 100% undisputable attribution to some malware operations. So for instance, we worked on some case in the past, which was the rigging malware family, which was known in the kind of security community to be somewhat associated to Western intelligence, but there was never any proof of that. And there has been many cases of that malware and those attacks being found against European institutions and European companies, including Belgacom, the European Council, and other agencies of that kind. But only after actually the Spiegel published some documents and even some malware sample that later on, through connecting with other samples that other security companies found, was able to be connected back to rigging. And then now we have 100% undisputable proof that rigging is Five Eyes malware. And that's a great and unprecedented achievement to be made, combining kind of technical research and source material that bring us a value that otherwise would be impossible to achieve. And regarding your second question, obviously, definitely terrorism and the recent events in 2015 have changed the debate heavily. We started from, the 2013, 2014, in which the privacy debate was leaning towards a direction because of the huge debate that spawned out of the Snowden documents. And now suddenly you see that the debate shifted, or flipped at least in some parts of the last year or two, with all the recent terrorist attacks in Paris and Brussels and so on, coming from a place of discussing whether certain surveillance programs should be banned and made illegal, to the point of discussing whether we should ban encryption, which is absolutely ludicrous, and we shouldn't even be talking about these kinds of things anymore. But these terrorist attacks obviously had an effect in the political sphere and obviously in the public, to the point where the debate shifted. And now we're set back to even 20 years back, when we've been discussing the crypto wars in the 90s. We were having the same debate we've been having in the 90s, and that debate was won by the privacy activist side. It's crazy. It's ridiculous that we're still having that debate now, even after there's Snowden revelations, and the only reason for that is because of the recent events.
Yeah, I think also, the terrorism scare is affecting also activists and journalists in countries like Turkey. Do you want to add something on this?
I want to add something from the previous question.
Yes.
And for example, within this On the Line project, we try to form a network from scratch between journalists and technical people. And I would describe it as really encounters with the third kind, because these two kind of currents of information should work hand in hand, but they are being so many times apart. And so really important thing to do. Of course, it won't solve all the problems once, but the close cooperation between tech people and journalists would certainly affect the things. And about the terrorism, the use of terrorism threat in order to oppress people and to maintain the cyber war, it's really important in Turkey, and especially with the current given political situation, when the political polarization is really high, it gives an important excuse to surveillance, for example, and to cyber war, and mostly for the online abuse also, for the framing of the context again. And the Turkish parliament has been passing some laws totally in line with the government's request. For example, we just had a new law about, it's called protection of personal data, but basically it's opening personal data to state surveillance. And I'm concerned that in Turkey we don't have an open debate about it, and it's not gathering so much public attention because we have really vital and crucial issues. For example, when you have really concrete terrorist attacks happening in the country, so the discussion about the surveillance, it's always delayed. But it's an important facet that we should come to terms.
Yeah. And I don't know if since we have like 5 minutes, are there questions from the audience? Yes.
Yeah, I'd like to ask you.
Wait for yeah.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to ask you, I don't know, to everybody right there, if you are aware of any research or database about numbers of the attacks and attribution of these attacks. I mean, I would like to understand to measure these attacks, to understand, because I never can understand when an attack could be attributed to a government or to a movement or an organization that is organized in some way, or when it's just a lonely wolf, someone that is just friendly friend of the government, or is just siding from the government, is trying to treat someone.
Yeah, and also sometimes you can have also multiple actors attacking the same target in different waves, like maybe happened in Sony. So
Again, thanks to Edward Snowden, there is a database we know of that is very, very extensive. It's the NSA database on cyber attacks, and not only their own cyber attacks, so cyber attacks done by the Five Eyes and the cyber arms and weaponry. But what we've seen, and I think you have some slides on that, is that they actually keep track on the offensive capabilities of every other nation state that is out there, and not only in an abstract form, but there are databases, of course, for attack vectors used by others. And of course, those databases could perhaps explain one thing. You mentioned the Sony hack. To me, it was astonishing at the first sight how quick the US government was, and it was very unheard of, actually, that a government would attribute a cyber attack as quickly as they did when the Sony hack occurred, which is not really surprising if you see what kind of knowledge the NSA has on attack vectors, on malware, on vulnerabilities other parties in this battle actually use. They actually not only learn from that and do some kind of back practice, what is working, which vulnerability is working where. They actually, which is even more interesting, sometimes just look what others do and actually use the content for themselves. They're piggybacking the spying results of others, which is perhaps the most comfortable way to do cyber espionage, not only seeing others doing it, but actually taking their results for yourself. We had that in several occasions. For instance, one occasion I'm thinking of when they did that was the Chinese spying on the UN. So the US not only saw that the Chinese would do that, but they would read the content of the intercepted messages.
Yeah, I want to add quickly to what Marcel has been mentioning, because that's some of the stuff that has come out is kind of insane. So Marcel has been mentioning the fact, in the context of attribution, things get really messy, even more messy than I thought it would have been before I started reading the documents. Because some of the things that they do, for example, they hijack botnets used by cyber criminals to use them as non-attributable nodes, so good luck identifying that there's some state behind that. But also, as Marcel has been mentioning, they piggyback on work of other foreign adversary intelligence agencies, and that's what they call third-party access. And that's exactly what they do. They hack into foreign hackers that have been hacking into other people to get the data that they've been stealing from the other people. And not only that, there's some examples in the Snowden documents. You can find them online on their Spiegel website. This is an example of that. Other interesting details of them using digital means to blowing things up. But they go farther than that. There's fourth-party access. They hack into people that hack into people to get the data. I mean, it's a level of hacking inception that it's kind of mind-boggling. And it goes up to a different level. This is another extract of a document in which they talk about hacking into North Korean and South Korean hackers to the point where they say even there is a fifth-party collection possibly in place in this case because they've been hacking into the North Korean that hacked into the South Korean that were hacking into someone else again. Like, you understand? At this point, like, you can't just keep track of these things anymore. And so in that sense, unless we really manage to tie the technical data with this type of source material, it becomes almost impossible to make any sort of connection. So yeah, this is kind of the theme of fifth-party access. To answer more directly on the database question, there isn't really a database pinpointing attack per attack to certain states. There's some resources online that collects all documentation about state-sponsored attacks that you can find. I personally keep a database of all documented attacks with contextual information on attacks against civil society members, so journalists and activists and so on. But it's a very limited scope, and I contain it only when I'm sure about the identity and the context in which the attack has been perpetrated. And in that case, we're talking about probably 200 and 250 attacks in the last few years. It's not very up to date, but as much as I can, I keep it so.
Excuse me? Okay. Yeah. So thank you all for being here, and thank you to the panelists.